Well, another 6 months happened for V, so of course we got updated decks for all our V decks. This time I'm going to be going over the Star Vader deck, because it's been 6 months since the last support wave, and now we got the complete Star Vader package with Clan Collection 3 and 4, so of course I'm going to go over it. And I'm just gonna have to say, the Star Vader support from the last wave and this wave has been pretty underwhelming. Pretty understandable because you don't want to make Star Vaders OP because of their mechanic of not letting your opponent play, essentially. And personally, I don't like the idea of not letting my opponent play if I'm just trying to have fun. But if you're trying to go for the kill and you're one of those very competitive player, I guess that you don't want to let your opponent play at all. So luckily they didn't make the new support too OP, but I only mainly built this deck because I really like the aesthetic of Link Joker and Star Vaders as a whole. Because take a look at it, it just looks awesome. Very evil and corrupted. Just love it. So anyway, how this deck functions is obviously locking your opponent. Basically, no rear guards for them to use. That's basically how the deck runs as a nutshell. In Chaos Breaker's case, if you play it as Chaos Breaker, you're going to be giving your opponent's force markers so you can steal your opponent's force markers, so you could spam your force markers on your field. It's a unique way, and I actually like that. And I really like that about Chaos Breaker's mechanic. But Chaos Breaker is the only pretty decent one in my opinion. But considering that the next two support waves after Chaos Breaker were a little underwhelming, it's a little iffy on playing it. But overall, I just play it for its aesthetic, not really to exactly have fun other than against Vanguard-centric decks, because at least they don't get real effective badly. But anyway, onto the deck profile. First off, keep in mind about a few things. There is no countercharge in this deck, and you do use quite a bit of soul in this deck, because there's a lot of cards that use soul in this deck for some reason. And also, keep your soul count to 1 at most, because the new support wave, particularly one card, wants you to keep your soul at maximum 1. So just keep that in mind, and also keep in mind how much soul you're going to be using. There is ways to refund soul, but your ways of using soul goes faster than refunding it in many cases. So just keep that in mind. And then, what gift marker would you use? You're obviously going to pick 1 because you can spam the force markers. Now you can pick 2 if you do not go for the Chaos Breaker play. But if you do go for the Chaos Breaker play, which is of course going to be your main play, and that's your main advantage engine usually, you're obviously going to go for 1 because you're going to be stealing your opponent's gift markers. And against those gift spamming decks, obviously this will be really good against that. And having more than 3 Force 2s is pretty much useless, so you might just pick Force 1 because you're going to need a lot of those. And then to the deck itself. First off, of course, the main boss card itself, you have to run the Chaos Breaker Dragon. So first off, on both Vanguard and Rearguard, it gets plus 10k if your opponent has a lock card. Easy condition, and that power boost really helps. But the main skills are, the second one is that it's an act, you can once per turn, counterblast 1, you give your opponent a force marker, but you also choose one of your opponent's rearguards and lock it. This is fine. Giving your opponent's force marker is actually what you want to do because it's a second skill where auto, when your opponent's rearguard is unlocked, you can Soul Blast 1 to retire that unlocked card, and then you take up to 2 of your opponent's gift markers, and then put the same amount of force markers as you took. So if this card takes the 2 gift markers on your opponent, you get the 2 gift markers for yourself. So this is gift marker stealing, and I just love this mechanic. It's a unique way of gift marker spamming, and unlike those other decks where it doesn't have unique ways, it just feels unsatisfying sometimes. And also, it just feels like a very cheap way of doing it, unlike this one who actually has some effort in doing it, and I like to achieve stuff. It's just me, but overall, this is just your main plus engine and basically your key card of the deck that you want to be on most of the time. Against gift spamming decks, you obviously want to stay on this because, yeah, you're just going to get more power from it. But against non-gift spamming decks, you're probably not going to stay on this too often. But this is still your main plus engine because draw power. Just keep your resources in mind when playing this card because there is no countercharge like I said in the beginning. And soul, you use soul faster than you regain it. So just keep those things in mind. But aesthetic wise, I just like it. Next, for the previous clan collection reasons, let's just show off the 2 Infinite Zeros. I personally do not like the Infinite Zero compared to the new Nebula Lord. I'd rather have more Nebula Lords, but Infinite Zero does have its uses because first off, on placed on Vanguard or rolled upon, you can counterblast 1, discard a card, choose one of your opponent's rearguards and lock it. But if you're at least 4 damage, you lock 1 front and 1 back instead. This is basically just a setup play card, but I just don't like how overcosted it could be because you do discard one card. I get why, because lock is very powerful, but it can be quite overcosted sometimes, especially at the early game where you don't really get much advantage. And even if I do go second, I prefer to ride something like Chaos Breaker over this because this card is pretty slow because you have to wait one extra turn to actually get your main play. This is more setup card than anything. But it is a decent ride target if you go first, so there is that. And then the second skill just gives you 5k power for every lock card on both Vanguard and Rearguard. That one's fine, but it's the first skill that you need to care about. It's a setup card, basically. But personally, I don't really like to ride it. The card that I prefer to ride, and in many ways it could be also a decent finisher or even first ride, Star Vader Nebula Lord Dragon. So first off, both his skills are Vanguard only, which his first one is an act, Soul Blast 1, so yeah, another Soul Blast. Retire one of your Star Vader rearguards, and then your opponent chooses one of their rearguards and lock it. If your opponent has no back row rearguards, this card gets Drive +1. And then, if your opponent did not lock a card, they must lock the top card of the deck. So what's nice is that if your opponent chooses to lock a front row, that basically kind of benefits you because they lose an attack. If your opponent decides to choose a back row, the likely chance is that they still get their 2 attacks. Your opponent loses the status of having back row rear guards, which gives an extra Drive +1. And if your opponent doesn't lock anything, well, they lock the top card of the deck. So either way, you're guaranteed a lock card from this. And that's what I like. And preferably, I do prefer this as a first ride option because at least that you can make your plays 1 turn sooner, unlike Infinite Zero, where you technically have to wait 1 turn. Sure, Infinite Zero can still lock, but you only get the full benefit of Infinite Zero if you're at 4 damage. And at least this one still gives you a Drive +1. Because in a way, Infinite Zero just has a different cost because they both still lock 1, but this one can get a Drive +1 on top of it. So yeah, this one, in my opinion, is still the better first ride, and it could be a decent finisher too, because the second skill, where count Vanguard during your turn, all your units with Star Vader its name gets plus 5k power for every of your opponent's lock cards. So you build up those lock cards, that's a huge power buff right there. And considering that this is basically a Star Vader deck, obviously you're going to get a huge power buff on your rear guards, which can be very nice. That's why sometimes you do want to ride this on top of the Infinite Zero, because that basically sets up your play. Infinite Zero will lock 2 by then, and then this will lock another. That'll be a 15k buff to everything. That could be insane. Now, if you're riding this on top of Chaos Breaker, I mean, sure, it's still 1 lock, but a 10k buff is still pretty powerful. And combined with some of your other cards, you might get the extra 10k buff for everything instead of 5k buff for everything. So yeah, this is overall a pretty good new card. Now, I still prefer to be at Chaos Breaker more, since it does give you your advantage, but to finish off the game, Nebula Lord definitely does it better, because Chaos Breaker doesn't really do much during your own turn, unless you have the combo piece to do so. So that's it for the grade 3 lineup. To the grade 2 lineup, we of course have to run the Circantium, because this is the best grade 2 we got, where on plays on both Vanguard and Rearguard, if you're Vanguard Star Vader, you can counter blast 1. Your opponent locks the top card of their deck. If it's on the back row, you also draw a card, and this card gets plus 10k. So there is no downside for you to force your opponent to lock a card most of the time. Because if they lock in the front, they lose attack. In back row, they lose a booster, which is not as significant, but you still get a draw and plus 10k buff. Sure, it does do a delay plus on your opponent, but that still benefits you in the long run because you do want more lock cards, and in some cases during the early game when your opponent has no lock cards, or those decks that don't have much of a rearguard presence, this really would save you. And the second skill is also pretty good, where it's count. If your opponent's Vanguard is at least a grade 3 while they have a lock card, your Vanguard becomes crit of 2. This is just a must play for up because this could be your savior. And then the next grade 2 that I don't like, Star Vader Colony Maker, because on plays you can Soul Blast 1, discard a card to look at the top 5 card to your deck for 1 Star Vader and call it as rest, but if your opponent has a lock card, it's stand instead. I have a problem with this because it's really overcosted. Yes, now it's a quote-unquote benefit to lower down your soul, and also the discard isn't bad entirely anymore because you do have those drop zone superior call effects from the new support. But overall, it's just very costed because it has 2 specific resource costs just for 1 card. So I personally don't like this card for that reason, especially when you're not going to use those superior calls for those discarded cards to come back too often, because they also have a cost. So I don't really like this card because how overcosted it is. But still, it does grant you your resources. In early game, it does have some uses, so of course I just run it, especially to search up some of your useful Star Vaders. But I just personally don't like this card for being overcosted. If they took out the Soul Blast, I definitely would run more. And then finally to the new Unrivaled Star Vader Radon. This is actually a really good card in my opinion. So first off, in the drop zone, you can superior call it in the same column as a Star Vader card with a Soul Blast 1. But if your soul is 1 or less, your Soul Blast cost is lost. So this is what I mean. You do want to Soul Blast as much as possible, which is possible because you are going to Soul Blast a lot, and you regain Soul slower than you Soul Blast. So yeah, doing this is quite possible. And this is what I mean for quote-unquote benefit because of this. This new support wave has those drop zone related abilities, so it's not entirely bad to discard, I just don't like it. And then the second skill, which is mandatory, is when this card attacks, when your opponent would want to guard this attack, it has the Battle Door effect. And then you must bind it. I hate this ability for being mandatory, and this is one other thing why people really don't like the new Star Vader wave. It's where the second skill where it's mandatory to use and then you have to lose it. The main good part is that you could at least recall this, and you don't really lose it from a discard. So I mainly run it for that reason, and the Battle Door effect can be pretty nasty, especially when you're stealing your opponent's gift markers. And now to the grade 1 lineup. You must still run the 4 Craving Claws. This is like the best card of the deck. So first off, when the boost or its attack hit on both Vanguard and Rearguard, you can look at the top 5 cards for a Star Vader. That's fine. The main part is the second skill, where it's an act. If your opponent's Vanguard is greater or greater, you can put this to Soul, choose one of your opponent's Rearguards and unlock it, and then choose another Rearguard and lock it. This is basically a lock trading, which is really good with Chaos Breaker. Because the idea is, if your opponent has a lock card, you would unlock it to lock another card, which that unlock part will trigger Chaos Breaker's skill. And that's what I like. And this also fixes the part where if your opponent decides to choose a back row rearguard, you can change that to a front row rearguard. That's another reason why this card is just really good. And one more thing is that this card also goes to Soul. So it does refill your Soul as well. And for Chaos Breaker case, it instantly basically kind of becomes a Soul Blast 0 and 1 turn sooner to use his skill. Yeah, this is just really good, must play 4 of. And then we go to Prison Gate, Star Vader, Palladium. So when rolled upon, you can call this to rearguard. That's fine, especially that you want your soul to be at most 1 of, so this is okay. And then the second skill is that when your opponent's rearguard is unlocked, you can counterblast 1, retire this unit, and then lock the top card of your opponent's deck. This is pretty nice to give your opponent another lock card for another turn, and in some cases, even with Chaos Breaker, with Craving Claw sometimes, it basically forces your opponent to still lose a column. So there is that, a nice extension of lock, and basically your opponent's still losing the rearguard zone. So either way, it's pretty decent. You're not going to use this too often, but it's there if you need it. Finally, the new Star Vader card that I just don't like, but still have to run, is the Mana Shot Star Vader Neon. So, just like Radon, it has a drop zone ability. So, at the beginning of your battle phase, you can counterblast 1 and call this to a rearguard with the same column as a lock card. The only thing is, it costs 1 counterblast. It's not really worth it for a grade 1. Sure, it negates some of your minuses like usual, but for a grade 1, probably not worth it. Now, if you have both Radon and Neon in the drop zone, it might be pretty decent because 1 counterblast to call 2 units can be pretty nice. And that's why I still run 2 copies, because this is still a pretty decent discard target, and it's just to combo up with another card. Now, the part I don't like is actually the second skill, where at the end of your opponent's turn, if your opponent did not unlock a card, which can happen because of Chaos Breaker, you bind this unit, and this effect is mandatory. So if you do not keep a lock card on your opponent, which sometimes will happen, you mandatory lose it. Yeah, I don't like that part, but you should be able to get control over it, but sometimes with Chaos Breaker that might not happen, and it's kind of overcosted to call back a grade 1 with 1 counterblast. But I do have to say, if you have this and Radon in the drop zone, that 1 counterblast can be worth it because you do get 2 units back from it, and Radon can be free. there is that, and it is still another Star Vader, so there is that. But in early game, this is definitely not good to call because your opponent is not going to have a lock rear guard for them to unlock during the end phase, so this is going to get mandatory bound and you're going to lose it. Something I hate. And then Manipulator of Gravity Fields. This is just here so you can have another way to get some soul. And the skill is that if your opponent has 2 or less rear guards, which can happen because of the locks, you can put this to soul and then choose 3 units and get plus 4k power in a turn. It's just there sometimes, and it's actually can fix some numbers, which has happened a few times as well. And soul reasons, which is why I actually run this. And finally, of course, the grade 3 searchers, because grade 3 searchers. And in my starter, choose whatever starter you want. This just looks like a Star Vader, so I just picked this one. And then for the trigger lineup, you of course have to go for 8 crits, draw PGs, and the 4 heal guardians, because there's nothing better. So that's it for this deck profile. This is my Star Vader deck. What do you guys think of it? What other changes that you make? Or what other cards would you recommend? This is just how I build it, and overall it has been working decently. It's not the best because Star Vader's hasn't really gotten really good support. And overall I am glad it's not overwhelming because that might actually break the meta. And I know how many people hate lock. I mainly play this deck for its aesthetic because I just like the design. So I just have to build this deck. But overall, I did have fun with it, mainly against those Vanguard-centric decks because at least they could actually play. I don't want to actually make my opponent not play, let's just say. I just like to have fun. But overall, at least that we finally got the whole Star Vader package, or at least most of them. We are still missing few original Star Vaders, but I am glad that we did get the Star Vader package with the 3 trio boss units for the original Star Vader lineup, not Glendale's. Because Chaos Breaker was something demanding, but the minute they gave us Infinite Zero, we just got to have Nebula Lord as well, just because Link Joker Invasion. But in that's it for this. See you all next time.